They lied to us about who owned bodies and who owned souls, and we will not accept that lie. We inherited stories polished by power, stories that hide the violence behind quiet doors and smiling portraits. In 1855, a woman named Celia fought back against what she called daily, unbearable violation of her person. She did not act from malice. She acted to stop a man who had no right to her body. Communities then called her a criminal. History tried to call her property, a thing, a legal object. We will call her instead by what she always was, a person with fear, courage, and a name. This film refuses the tidy myths that made murderers of those who resisted brutal ownership. We refuse to let legal records baptize a crime where there was desperate human self-defense. Across the pages of the court docket, we find not sober justice but the echoes of a system. That system declared some lives less worthy, some bodies open to theft, violence, and silence. We remember Celia not because she broke a law, but because she ruptured the premise of ownership. Her story forces us to ask who writes history, whose evidence is trusted, and who is erased. We reclaim the names the law tried to strip, and we demand the truth be spoken plainly. Listen, history is not neutral. It is a battleground where memory and power contend for control. We stand on the side of those denied their full humanity by courts and by custom alike. Repeat after us. She wasn't property, she was human, and let that truth burn through every record. Let the opening of this series be a summons. Feel the pain, feed the rage, and remember with us. We begin here, with Celia's defiant act, and carry her voice forward as our guiding, unignorable moral flame. Before we speak of Celia's final night, we must return to the world that built her cage. Mid-19th century Missouri was not a place of freedom. It was the borderland between law and hypocrisy. America was growing rich on cotton, tobacco, and the endless hours stolen from black hands. They called it progress. We call it what it was, the machinery of human theft. In 1850, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that criminalized compassion itself. If a person fled the chains, any citizen was required to help return them, to hunt them. The system turned ordinary people into accomplices, into silent enforcers of a moral catastrophe. Missouri, where Celia lived, was part of this machinery, a so-called slave state dressed in false civility. Behind whitewashed porches and church sermons, bodies were being traded, violated, and broken. And the law, always the law, stood guard over the violators. Celia was 14 when she was purchased by a man named Robert Newsom. Purchased as if a human soul could be bought, as if pain could be owned. From the first night in his house, Newsom forced himself on her. Year after year, she endured what no person should be asked to survive. She bore his children. She begged him to stop. He refused. Every plea for dignity was met with power, every cry with silence. By 1855, Celia had lived 5 years in that private war, a war no one would name. Enslaved women were expected to be obedient, docile, silent. The law offered no refuge. Courts refused to recognize rape between a master and the enslaved. A black woman's pain had no standing in a white man's world. And yet, within that silence, resistance began to form. Quiet, trembling, but real. Historians later wrote that Celia pleaded with Newsom's daughters to protect her, to intervene. She asked them to keep their father away from her cabin. They did nothing. Perhaps they feared him, or perhaps they did not see her as fully human. When he came again one night, Celia had made a choice no one expected. She fought back. She struck him with a stick, and the man who had treated her as property fell. The system called it murder. We call it a cry for self-possession. At that moment, a young black woman dared to claim the smallest piece of control: her body, her right to live unviolated. But in 1855 Missouri, a black woman's act of self-defense was never seen as justice. She was arrested, interrogated, and condemned by the very laws that denied her humanity. The court that heard her case would not even allow her lawyers to argue self-defense because she was enslaved. To the law, she was not a woman protecting herself. She was a man's property destroying another man's property. This was not justice. It was the language of ownership masquerading as law. A system where rape was invisible, but resistance was unforgivable. The trial was swift, the verdict predetermined, the sentence absolute: death by hanging. When Celia was executed in December 1855, the newspapers spoke of order restored. But what they called order was built on terror. They buried her body, but not her defiance. We dig it back up now, with every word we speak, with every truth they tried to hide. Because in that courtroom, in that gallows, America revealed its soul. And in Celia's act, humanity fought to breathe beneath the weight of its own denial. Celia's story does not stand alone. It lives among thousands of silenced acts of survival. Moments when black women and men resisted the unbearable. Each name is a fragment of truth, a piece of the buried archive that power tried to erase. To understand Celia, we must see her as part of a system and a movement of endurance that never had permission to call itself rebellion. Let us begin with her final days. The trial of Celia, an enslaved woman, began in October 1855. Her lawyers argued that she had the same right as any woman, the right to defend herself against sexual assault. But the court refused to recognize her as any woman. The judge ruled that the law against rape did not apply to enslaved people. In the eyes of Missouri, Celia was not a victim. She was property that had destroyed its owner. Witnesses spoke about her calm, her clarity, her refusal to beg. She confessed that she had struck Newsom, that she had burned his body, that she had acted because she could take no more. Each statement was a testament not to guilt, but to humanity. The newspapers described her as depraved. We call her resolute. When she was sentenced to death, she asked one thing: that her execution be delayed until she gave birth. Even facing the rope, she was still forced to carry the child of her oppressor. They denied her mercy. They called it justice. And the day she died, the state of Missouri recorded her name only as Celia, a slave. No surname, no grave, no history. Yet Celia was not an anomaly. She was a mirror. Harriet Jacobs, another enslaved woman, lived a century's worth of resistance in her own silence. Born in North Carolina in 1813, Harriet was pursued relentlessly by her enslaver, Dr. James Norcom. To escape his abuse, she hid for 7 years in an attic crawl space only 9 feet long and 3 feet high. For 7 years, she could not stand upright, could not see her children except through a crack in the wall. In her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she wrote, "Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women." Through her endurance, Harriet Jacobs transformed hiding into protest, invisibility into testimony. Her story, like Celia's, exposes the violence that law and religion conspired to deny. Then there were Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, 3 enslaved women who were experimented on by Dr. J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology. He operated on them without anesthesia, dozens of times, in search of medical prestige. Their pain became his career. Their bodies became the foundation of a science that never asked their consent. When he succeeded, he was celebrated. When they screamed, history went silent. We remember them now, not as passive subjects, but as women who endured the unspeakable so that others might one day be spared. Their suffering is not the cost of progress. It is the indictment of a system that equated black bodies with tools. Celia, Harriet, Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy. Different names, same sentence. Dehumanization justified by law, by profit, by fear. In every story, we see the same machinery: white men claiming divine right over life, and white institutions defending their cruelty as order. Even the so-called benevolent owners were complicit. Plantation diaries reveal how ordinary violence became domestic routine. Whippings recorded like inventory. Pregnancies listed beside crop yields. A woman sold alongside a mule. This was not aberration, it was the design. A legal system that turned human beings into ledger lines and receipts. But the enslaved were never merely victims. They strategized, resisted, and redefined survival itself. Celia's defiance was physical. Harriet's was psychological. Anarcha's was unchosen but immortalized through endurance. Each act whispered the same truth. You can own a body, but never the will to be free. There were men, too, who rose against impossible odds, like Dred Scott, who sued for his freedom only to be told by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857 that a black man has no rights which a white man is bound to respect. Or like Nat Turner, who led a rebellion in Virginia and was hanged for daring to believe that liberation could be claimed by force. Their actions terrified the South, not because they were violent, but because they revealed that even in bondage, black humanity could not be extinguished. Celia's act was smaller in scale, but it struck at the same foundation. She refused to let her body remain a site of conquest. She refused to be a passive witness to her own violation. And for that, the state made an example of her. Her hanging was meant as a warning to others. Do not fight back. Do not imagine ownership can be broken. But every warning becomes a record. Every execution becomes an archive of resistance. And from that archive, we reclaim strength. Consider also the story of Pata Seca, an enslaved man in Brazil forced to father over 200 children for breeding stock. His body was used as a machine of empire, his humanity stripped for profit. The system that crushed Celia was not confined to one nation. It was global. From the Caribbean plantations to the American South, from Congo's rubber fields to the sugar colonies, the pattern was identical. Dehumanize, exploit, erase, and still, they resisted. Through love, through flight, through education, through revolt. When we read these names, we are not reading tragedies. We are reading blueprints for endurance, for rebellion disguised as survival. The enslaved were not silent. They were silenced. Their acts, however small, cracked the structure of domination from within. Celia's story ends in death, but it also begins something larger, a reckoning. Her resistance forces us to confront not only her oppressor, but the entire civilization that condoned him. Because what was on trial in 1855 was not just a woman who killed her master. It was the idea that a human being could ever belong to another. That idea died slowly, but it began to die the night Celia fought back. We remember her, not as a tragic figure, but as one of the first to declare, even wordlessly, that survival is a right, not a privilege. That resistance is not rebellion, it is restoration. And that the human soul, even when enslaved, remains untouchable. The story of Celia is not ancient. It is not distant. It is a mirror still hanging on the wall of our civilization, and we are reflected in it. Every chain that rattled in the past forged the systems that still shape our present. Every courtroom that refused to see her humanity built the legal foundations that still measure worth unequally. When Celia stood before her judges, she was not only one woman against one man. She was one soul standing against the entire structure of ownership, against a nation that had confused morality with property. They called her crime murder. We call it a verdict on the conscience of America. Her defiance did not die with her. It bled into every protest that came after, every refusal, every voice that said no more. Because the line from the plantation to the prison, from the auction block to the wage gap, from the rope to the bullet, that line is unbroken. It bends and shifts, but it never disappears. We are taught to believe slavery ended with law, but laws do not end what they were built to protect. They mutate, they reappear. They change their language, but not their logic. Ownership became debt. Chains became policies. Whips became statistics. And silence remained the weapon. The same silence that protected Robert Newsom protects systems today. The same disbelief that denied Celia's right to self-defense questions women's voices now. When a Black woman says, "I was violated," the world still asks her to prove her pain. When she demands justice, the world still asks her to calm down. And when she resists, she is still called dangerous. Celia's fight is therefore not a relic. It is an inheritance. It calls us to see how deeply the myth of ownership runs. The idea that some bodies exist for others' use. That power decides who deserves compassion. This is the moral disease that outlived the gallows. We must say it clearly. Celia was not property. She was human. Her act was not the fall of morality. It was its resurrection. She reminded the world that morality without empathy is only rule-keeping. That law without justice is only control. That freedom without memory is only illusion. When we remember her, we are not indulging in tragedy. We are confronting complicity. Because history does not stay buried. It reincarnates in our institutions, our biases, our comfort. Each time we look away from injustice, we replay the silence of that Missouri courtroom. Each time we reduce a person to labor, to numbers, to stereotype, we repeat the logic of slavery. The only way to break that repetition is to remember differently, to remember truthfully. Celia's story teaches us the anatomy of resistance. It begins not with weapons, but with recognition. She looked at herself and saw something the world refused to see, a person worth defending. That recognition is the first act of freedom, and it is still the most dangerous act in a system built on hierarchy. We reclaim that act every time we tell her story without shame or dilution. We refuse to let history disguise violence as the past, because the past is not over. It is present, breathing through every structure that still decides whose life matters. Look around. Mass incarceration, reproductive injustice, racial violence, economic exploitation, these are not new battles. They are the modern dialects of the same old language. Celia's defiance whispers through them all, reminding us that resistance is not chaos. It is clarity. It is what happens when the soul refuses to be reduced. The moral revelation is simple but unbearable. A society that punishes self-defense more harshly than assault cannot call itself civilized. A culture that memorializes oppressors and forgets the oppressed has chosen comfort over truth. But we choose truth. We reclaim it even when it burns. Because only through truth can we rebuild the moral ground beneath us. Celia forces us to ask, What does it mean to be human when humanity is denied by law? Her answer is not in her words. It is in her act. It is the same answer whispered by every enslaved mother, every rebel, every survivor. To be human is to defend the sacredness of your own life, even when the world says you cannot. That is why we remember. Not to reopen wounds, but to refuse the anesthesia of forgetting. Because remembrance is resistance, and resistance at its core is love. The fierce kind that refuses to let injustice be normal. We have walked through darkness, through fields of ash, through courtrooms of silence, through a nation's open wound. And yet, from every scar, light still escapes. Because stories like Celia's are not graves, they are seeds. They remind us that justice does not begin with laws. It begins with memory, with the courage to say the names that history buried. We do not retell these stories for pity. We retell them to make truth visible again. Celia's act was called a crime. We call it a beginning. It began the moment she said no to the structure of ownership. It began the moment she decided that survival was not submission. And it continues every time someone refuses silence in the face of oppression. We carry that same fire. Every no we speak to injustice is a continuation of hers. Every demand for equality, every insistence on dignity, every protest, every truth told out loud, all of it belongs to the same lineage. This is not nostalgia. It is reclamation. Because we are not only witnesses to history, we are the restoration of what history tried to erase. We are the descendants of those who built empires under chains, who sang freedom songs under stars they could not name. Their endurance became our inheritance. Their resistance became our moral DNA. Look around you. The systems have changed their uniforms, but not their logic. We are still told to wait, to be patient, to forgive what has not yet repented. But Celia teaches us that waiting is not freedom. Freedom is action. Freedom is truth spoken even when it trembles. Freedom is remembering loudly enough to make the world uncomfortable. So we remember, not softly, but with purpose. We remember because forgetting is the final victory of oppression. We remember because silence is complicity. We remember because Celia's breath, cut short on the gallows, still asks, "Who will speak now?" We speak. We act. We reclaim. We honor Celia not by mourning her, but by continuing her unfinished work. The work of demanding full humanity for every life still weighed and priced by systems of power. We demand that education tell the truth. We demand that justice see color, gender, history, and repair what was broken. We demand that remembrance itself become resistance. The call is not just for scholars or activists. It is for anyone who believes that history must serve humanity, not the other way around. It is for every listener who feels that quiet anger rising in their chest right now. Hold it. Don't look away. That anger is sacred. That is Celia speaking through you. And when you tell her story, when you share her name, when you refuse to let her disappear again, you are not only honoring the past, you are building a future where no one must die to prove they are human. So say it again with us, and let it echo beyond this screen. She wasn't property. She was human. And because she was human, we owe her truth. Because she was human, we owe her justice. Because she was human, we owe her memory. Alive, defiant, unbroken. We don't just remember, we reclaim, we rise, and we continue the story they tried to silence.